is not only important for what you're doing on a day-to-day, but as it refers to Perkins funding, which I know a lot of you either are receiving or would like to receive, that's going to be a very important aspect to focus on this year. And we want you guys to be clear on, how we will be helping you to support that particular population as well. We want you to learn about the Explore, Prepare, Apply framework for post-secondary readiness, along with strategies that support MLLs and ELLs and students with IEPs with post-secondary planning. So that is hopefully what you will be walking away with today. So moving to the next slide. Norming. So, we want to make sure that for those of you who are working with these populations or have worked with these populations, that we get a sense of, what is it that people expect and what is the reality. So some common assumptions around our populations and what they are capable of. The assumption number one is all Ls are immigrants or undocumented, when the reality is that 47%, of Ls are born in the United States. Obviously, 53% who are not born in the United States, who may be undocumented or documented, live in a range of statuses in terms of their families. And so there is not one story when it comes to immigration or to our L students. The second assumption is that English proficiency is an indicator of their intellect or learning ability. And we know that that definitely is not true, because English proficiency does not impact an L student's ability to engage in higher order thinking or to develop academic language, or to leverage background knowledge and experiences, or utilize home language to engage in instruction. So, we want people to really be understanding of the fact that, students can achieve, and that there are multiple entry points in engaging with the content, including scaffolding, language supports, drawing on student experience. So we want to make sure that we're not pigeonholing what we feel the ability of the student is. Also, English is their second language. Sometimes English can be their third or fourth language. So we do want to make sure that we are open to finding out more about our students, their dialects, and what they've picked up at home, or in their home country, and not to make that assumption. Also, all Ls share a similar background, culture, or socioeconomic status. We know that that is definitely not true, because they cover a cross-section of classes, racial and ethnic, religious, linguistic, and academic experiences. So just to be really sensitive to the fact that the DOE represents 155 home languages, 192 places of birth, and then Ls, of course, cover that huge landscape, and that may have impacted them, depending on, where they've come from. They may have escaped political or religious or ethnic persecution. Others may have been motivated to immigrate here by the promise of a better economic and educational opportunity. So there's so many reasons why they come, so many places they come from, and we do want to make sure we recognize that as well. And then finally, too many students have IEPs. That definitely is an assumption that we definitely want to dispel. 20% of students in the DOE have IEPs. And then in terms of adult Americans with disabilities, that's at 26%. So just being understanding of the fact that many of our commonly held assumptions are false, and making sure that we interrogate the truth of our own beliefs consistently, and that we engage Ls to make an effort and not to paint our students all with the same brush. So we do want to make sure we set that up as a norm. And then moving to the next slide, post-secondary mindsets is definitely important for us as we look to support our students on the road to college and career readiness. So we always want to underscore the fact that anyone can go to college and have a fulfilling career, regardless of their immigration status or disability. Anyone can be an MLL or ELL or SWID advocate. And, we want to make sure we support college and career readiness by reinforcing the mindsets, the information, and the skills that students will need for post-secondary success. Our special population students are protagonists of their own college and career journeys, so always wanting to empower them and making sure they have the tools to be able to do this work as well with us while we support them. And that SWIDs can continue to receive services in college and vocational programs via Access VR and other college offices of accessibility. And then finally, all Americans benefit from the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that's something that we hope that more people will find, important information on. We do want to make sure that we are able to help them bring their career identities, their knowledge, their experience, and their preferences to the conversation and really create space for access. And then we want to make sure that we have the information that is needed to be able to give them clear guidance and the steps that will be involved in its career or college application process, to make sure that we are not assuming their status, but that we're sharing the information with their students and their families as well, on all platforms. And then moving to the next slide, we want for folks to really understand what work-based learning is. I know most of you here are coordinators, but there may be a few who are supporting the work and maybe doing, maybe wearing other hats or doing other roles in the school. So just to be clear about the fact that WBL is an educational strategy that enhances classroom learning by connecting it to the workplace. So we want to make sure that any activities and events that are planned are helping to expose young people to the pathway of your high school, as well as the industry partners that are providing the opportunities for that exposure. So you want your students to be able to understand what it is that they're doing, how that connects back to the CTE learning in the classroom, as well as the way that they are able to, make sure that the industry partner and the industry experiences are giving them another way to understand what they're going to be expecting to do in the workforce eventually. And so moving to the next slide, we want you guys to really be aware of the connection between academic skills, employability skills, and technical skills. All three kind of work hand in hand. And, the 21st century skills, includes things like teamwork, time management, creative thinking. Those are the skill sets that employers right now are asking for, and are finding to be most important for someone to be successful in the workplace. So while we want to focus on the technical skills, what we also call hard skills or what they're learning in CTE class, we want to make sure that, students can tie that back to, being able to assimilate well, to take instruction, to take initiative. Those types of things will hopefully lead to a connection of all three and the ability for students to be successful overall. So from that, I will move into the next poll question. And hopefully you guys can use the chat to answer this as well. Do you know, that should be, do you know who your special population students are? And so if you could take a few minutes and think through the answer to that question, that would be great. Many people are saying yes. Great. And that ties us back to how do you know? Hopefully all of you guys have access to, whether it's STARS, however you are finding your student information. We want to make sure that that is accurate and that you are aware of how your students are showing up in the system so that you can do a better job of providing the support that they need. Oftentimes, a student may be qualified as a certain population, and then that may change as they go through years 9 through 12. So it's also important to know that a student may start off as, for example, with disabilities in the system. And depending on how the IEP changes, that categorization could change as well, depending on, how that student progresses. So it's important to really follow the journey of the student and make sure that you have the right information. So moving to the next slide, you want to also be understanding of how this work shows up at your school. The work-based learning scope and sequence will help you to be able to combine the explore, prepare, and apply aspects of this framework to be able to build an experience for your students every step of the way so that they have an opportunity to really benefit from the work that you're doing. So we want you to be able to use some of the resources that are here for you as you continue to stack your scope and sequence for students from 9th grade all the way through 12th grade. We want you to be able to utilize the resources here. And so this particular blueprint is going to be available in the resource folder. It will help you to, use some sample work-based learning scope and sequences and hopefully kind of develop something of your own. And, we want to also make sure that you have that blank template to, include reflection questions and activities and resources so that you can feel really confident in what you have for your students to experience. So that's something that will be available for you. And another resource as we move to the next slide that you guys maybe have already seen is the work-based learning scope and sequence map. And this is something that was created late last year. Also has a lot of information that includes what NYSED has deemed valid for work-based learning hours. It talks through, what a student should be doing based on their grade level. It also includes the New York City, gosh, I'm looking here and I can't really see the slide very well, I'm sorry. It includes basically the WBL grid, which also talks about the exceptions for this year based on COVID. And it also has the scaffolding for both Ls and SWIDs. So you can look at this and really kind of get a huge amount of content that is specific to your populations. And so hopefully people have already started accessing this. It's definitely available and the link will be provided in the resource folder as well. So I will stop there and I will hand it over to my colleague, Yesenia Crespo, who can talk more about the Explore, Prepare, and Apply framework as you start to think about building your scope and sequence.
Thank you, Takiyah. So before jumping into Explore, Prepare, Apply, I have created a little note taker for everyone. So the note taker, I just dropped the link into the chat. You're able to make a copy for yourself. And the note catcher is just intended to go through the Explore, Prepare, Apply phases, kind of go through definitions of such, allow you to jot down some strategies, and also identify the people who may not be in this room, who may be key partners in helping you implement some of these strategies that we'll be discussing. And I think what's really important is really thinking about how, your WBL sequence is not just you individually, but it's a collective responsibility. And we'll dig a little deeper as to like what that can look like when we talk about the Explore, Prepare, Apply framework. And for us, for the Division of Multilingual Learners, the Explore, Prepare, Apply framework is a framework for post-secondary readiness. And really, it's expected to equip students when supporting your multilingual learners or even students with disabilities with the post-secondary readiness that equips them with the mindset, skills, knowledge that empowers them to be protagonists in their post-secondary journeys, right? And like when we think about the 3 key phases, explore, prepare, apply, each of them build onto one another. And what I will say about engaging with ELs in particular when thinking about explore, prepare, apply is when thinking about your scope and sequence, usually we think about it in terms of 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th grade and what experiences those students should have. And I will push you a little bit further to think about when engaging with ELs, you might want to assess where they are ELs don't experience work-based learning, post-secondary readiness in a linear format. And what I mean by that is you can have an 11th grader who is a newcomer and maybe in the 11th grade, but has never engaged in a career assessment or personality test or some form of inventory, career assessment inventory. So we really encourage you to think about the 3 phases under Explore, Prepare, Apply to really assess where your students are, because they may not fall into where you expect them to be by their grade level, depending on when they've entered or what access do they have to particular opportunities. So really, we're hoping that through Explore, Prepare, Apply, it's really about exploration, preparation, and application. They're all expected to build on to one another in order to support a successful post-secondary readiness for students. And each of these, and we'll go through each phase, and each of this stage has a particular set of questions, strategies, and activities that will associate with them. And of course, their undercurrent, if you can go back, Rita, I just want to uplift, like they're really undercurrent by these pillars that we live by. We call them the 4 pillars of L post-secondary engagement. And they're really approaches. And they're approaches around community, social-emotional learning, access, and culturally responsive sustaining education. And we really believe that these pillars are really important in order to not only think about the experiences, but the approaches that we as educators, work-based learning coordinators, communities should be entering into the space when working with our students. So in the spirit of community, I would like to hand this over to my colleague, Audrey, to introduce us to Explore.
Thank you so much, Yesenia, much appreciated. Next slide, please. Thank you, thank you. So when we're thinking about exploration, we want the students to really understand themselves. And to Yesenia's point, you really want to think about the students getting their own thinking about where they're at, what they like, what they need to do. And if that means that you have to engage in a survey with your students, or if you're looking at their most recent IEP to find their strengths, their interests, you're doing everything you can to really give the students voice and agency in their own exploration, because those are the skills they're going to be building upon throughout this entire process to become that independent young adult. So you're starting to facilitate those conversations so students understand more about the attributes that they're bringing to the potential workplace, connected to their racial, cultural, linguistic, as well as neurodiverse identities, as you're connecting them to potential post-secondary planning. You want to engage your students and multilingual learners and students with disabilities about their strengths, what their learning style brings to the table, and areas they can focus on for growth. So this way, you also want to include, and it's a natural fit for the CFM course, to have a preview of the Americans with Disability path, and also learning about emerging technologies as well as professions as it pertains to the workplace. And by engaging in self-exploration in a way that's asset-based and affirming and positive, students are able to remind themselves that they have what it takes. The future's there, and they're able to discover and start to articulate their strengths, their interests, their values, and develop that habit of mind to come back and self-reflect to see what they want in their future, connected to college, career, life, as well as making sure that they know they're bringing assets to the table, they're bringing forth strengths, and they're going to make an incredible impact on the world in the future. Next slide, please.
So let's dig a little deeper. Let's talk about activities that will fall under Explore and highlight a variety of scaffolds for ELs and students with disabilities that might allow students to discover more about themselves and the pathways available to them. So thinking about, for guest speakers, some strategies you might want to consider or scaffolds is identify speakers who are racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse. you might want to, we want students to be exposed to professionals who look like them and share similar backgrounds and experiences. We want students to be able to see the endless opportunities that are available to them and not be limited by what they see on television, or not have an understanding of opportunities that might be available to them. Even when thinking about a sector or an industry, like in thinking about law, there are various positions within the law industry. It's not just the lawyer. So being able to expose students to even the various career options within an industry is so important. Something else to think about is we've included here panel questions for you to be able to leverage that uplift multilingualism as an asset. As we know, there are many folks. There's actually 46% or more of employers say that they depend heavily on translation support, depending on the industry. So really encourage students to be able to uplift their multilingualism as an asset, but encourage your speakers to also talk about that and normalize that experience for students. And then reinforce that students can have a career regardless of immigration status. As an independent contractor or an entrepreneur, there are definitely pathways for undocumented students, and we want to be able to uplift that and share that with students and have our guest speakers reflect those things, and have our guest speakers also reiterate that information to students. And then also thinking about your students with disabilities, thinking about making sure that guest speakers are aware of the school's neurodiverse and L population while respecting students' privacy and confidentiality. So that's really important to think about in preparing your guest speakers and your guest speakers and career day speakers in order to ensure who is your Ls, who are your students with disabilities, and how to best be able to articulate and speak with them when hosting these type of opportunities. When thinking about mentoring, some two best practices is really about thinking about potentially matching students based on home language. So if you have a low-level Spanish speaker like I do right now as a workspace mentor, thinking about how do I match that student with someone else who also shares the home language so that the student feels comfortable in being open and sharing their own experiences, but feel open about creating a safe space of practicing their English, but also continuing to strengthen their home language as well. And then also raise the importance of, an awareness of, neurodiversity and multilingualism in the workplace, and what does that look like? Next slide.
Okay, so for workplace tours and job shadowing, some of the best tips we can give you are most definitely share the workplace importance of highlighting any employee that they may have on staff with a disability who's comfortable with sharing their experience at the site. You want to prepare your students, all students, by giving them a specific note catcher, graphic organizer, or reflective questions to make the connections between the workplace and the classroom learning as important and overt as possible. This is especially helpful in a remote setting where students will be engaging in virtual workplace tours. You want to provide the guidance to the students to be as presentable as possible within the confines of your remote space. And part of that remote learning will be changing their background, etc., as necessary. And you want to uplift the fact that the students who are multilingual and diverse in their presentation as possible. So this way, you're connecting the 3 domains of transition: employment, education, and independent living, with the actual employees at the work site. Then you also want to think about your career, interest, and personality assessments. You want to be sure that you have all of your resources translated into the languages that your students speak and engage with and represent. You also can utilize Google Translate or the other online translation tools for support in your specific area. The Division of Multilingual Learners has a fantastic self-exploration workbook as the foundation for their discovery within career interest and inventory. And you also, for your students with disabilities, you want to refer to the IEPs for updated student interests. And many times what'll happen, as Yesenia alluded to, if the student was initially interested in becoming a lawyer, let's say, or a doctor, and they found in their career exploration that there's another career path that connects to that initial passion for that particular trade, you can share that updated information with the IEP case manager and let them know that as part of their exploration and continuum with their transition process, students have made changes and they're interested in something new, which is really wonderful because our students are dynamic, their interests change, and as we know, we're training students for professions that don't exist today, so the workplace is equally as dynamic. Next slide, please.
So I want to just uplift, before jumping in, just uplift that some comments that I'm seeing in the chat. So there was a question. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, so I apologize. Shauna Gonzalez, and talked about ISP and supporting undocumented students, which we will get to in a second under prepare, and I will definitely uplift that at that point. And then in terms of, there was a comment around getting access to the self-exploration workbook. We will be providing at the end of this presentation copy of the deck in a resource folder, and all of the PowerPoint and all of the links attached you'll definitely have access to. So definitely want to ensure that while we're not literally reading every single bullet that's here, we're definitely uplifting some of them. This is a very rich, heavy deck, and we understand that that definitely it can be very challenging so to get through all of this. So we want to be able to hand this back to you at your own time. You can go through the deck and access the additional resources are there. So we will definitely get that to you. And if you have questions, continue putting them into the chat. We can respond to them either in the chat or bring them up into the larger group. And I will address some of those things as well. So continuing on under Explore, we'll talk about individual advisement and post-secondary planning, thinking about checking out our best practices to supporting virtual advisement and ways to support ELS. And it can function for SWDs and other students. It's really to prepare students for the future that are aligned to the 4 pillars of EL engagement. So thinking about community, accessibility, social-emotional learning, and culturally responsive sustaining education. We also want to encourage students to ask questions to their counselors to create a post-secondary plan, a success plan using, DML has created a questions by the dozen tool to assist students and families in having conversations with the counselors. As we know, there may be many immigrant families who may not be familiar with the role of a school counselor. So being able to share this resource, but also educating them around the role of a school counselor, the role they play in their students' post-secondary plan is definitely something that can be extremely helpful. And then also encouraging students to explore all post-secondary options available, including vocational and career training opportunities, not just college opportunities, but all post-secondary pathways. And we've linked here a really, really great tool that was launched by New Visions in November that is really accessible and allows you to literally sift through as many post-secondary options available to students that you can, in order to get a pathway directly into family sustaining job and career options. So definitely check that out. When thinking about college and career visits and financial aid, we know in the time of COVID, it's very difficult to attend any colleges. So we really encourage you to either provide students a checklist or some type of like bingo activity in order to engage in virtual college tours. And we've linked here a virtual college tour website for you to be able to access and also encourage your students to be able to engage in some form of bingo activity, but also DML's College Search Workbook, which all of DML's resources are translated in all 9 DOE languages. So that way, if students want to practice their English, but also read in their home language, they can leverage both content in their home language and in English. We also encourage you to, when thinking about college visits and financial aid visits, have students who were former Ls or students who were former students with disabilities or IEP students or immigrant youth speak to students about college and about like their post-secondary pathway, connect with your network of alum in order for them to come in and talk to students and share with them their lessons and their things that they've learned from their experience, but also normalize kind of this uncertainty and confusion. I don't know if you had, depending on your own process for applying to college, but one of my colleagues talks about she lived in China and was applying for college here, and it was first generation student. It was so confusing for her to the entire application process. It's very daunting. So being able to normalize uncertainty and confusion for your students is so important, but also sharing your own experience with your students, whether positive or negative, being able to share those opportunities with students really allows them to see you as people, but also gets an opportunity for them to learn more from various experiences. Next slide.
Thank you. As part of our work here today, what we want to do to continue to prepare students is to ensure that students have everything they need for a meaningful and fulfilling high school experience, and connected to those 3 domains of transition: employment, education, and independent living. This is where they're going to create that plan and create the overt linkages where the school's role is to connect students with the post-secondary institutions and make that process very overt for families, for students. So this preparation process is vitally important because it's going to prepare. And many times we have to remember that, as Yesenia pointed out, this tradition of students going from high school to post-secondary, you may be talking to a first-generation American or a new immigrant or a student with a disability who doesn't have the background of attending school post high school. So you really want to make that as overt every step as possible for the students as well as for the families, so that the students can remain on track for their post-secondary goals by exploring what's available to them, learning new skills, meeting new people. And it may be a process for those students to feel comfortable connecting with new people, supporting them. And also, this is the part in that preparation of training for self-advocacy, where students are going to have to be able to speak up for their needs, because once they leave the high school setting, if they're, let's say, a student with a disability and they're receiving services, the process of being entitled to services ends once they exit, graduate, or leave high school, and it becomes a process of being entitled, so where students may be eligible for services, but they have to be able to ask for that. And we know in the TCACs, we can run professional development seminars for students to engage in self-advocacy, to engage in self-determination. So we really want to be sure that every articulation agreement that you may have as a CTE school, that your school has connected with that particular college's Office of Accessibility, so students are able to connect with the personnel that they may have to speak to about their disability, share their IEP, and see what accommodations may be eligible for them under the Americans with Disability Act. It's an opportunity to explain systems, build up that cultural capital, and break down some obstacles to empowerment. So long-term, students can really maximize their benefit from being in a CTE program, or if they're in college now, or if they're taking AP courses. And so families also learn about the process of self-disclosure, self-advocacy, and how it's going to help the students in the long run, all under the auspices of preparation. Next slide, please.
Sorry, I was on mute and trying to respond to the chat. Sorry. So in thinking about, again, thinking about prepare and wanting to dig a little bit deeper, we want to think about resume and cover letter development and thinking about scaffolding content to support accessibility for your students. And we've linked here a scaffolding doc for you to be able to check out and really engage with in order to best support your students with ensuring content is actually landing. We've also included here DML's Career Exploration Workbook, available in all 9 DOE languages, which lays out all of the steps to develop a resume and empower students to begin their job search while in high school. We'll also be releasing additional career preparedness and planning workbooks in the upcoming months, hopefully by the ending of February, beginning of March, in order that supports the development of a cover letter, job application, and interviewing skills. We also want to remind students to uplift their multilingualism as an asset and think of and utilize career terminology and practices in their resume. And, you know, just reiterating what Audrey mentioned earlier, is thinking about scheduling a training with TCAC for disability disclosure or digital resume writing workshop. And I will, you know, there were some questions about what activities are we providing centrally. And I will ask Audrey when we jump into internships to talk a little bit about TOP, but also towards the end, we can share kind of the OPSR is creating some career for the month of February. They're doing some career exploration month activities that they'll be planning. So is DML and I think TCAC as well. So we'll be able to share that information with you towards the end so that you have access to that information, and we'll upload all of the calendars and any information that is relevant in the resource folder so that you have access to that as well. And then continuing on, thinking about for an elevator pitch, you know, we want to, something that's really important with working with ELs is avoiding jargon. So for example, there are certain terminology or words that don't necessarily translate. So for example, when you say CUNY, students might not know what CUNY is. And when you translate CUNY into their home language, that might not necessarily translate in the manner that you want them to. So being able to like avoid using jargon or provide more examples or being more detailed with your language is so important in helping students be able to prepare their elevator pitch. And we actually have linked here a do's and don'ts of EL instruction in order to best support ELs during this process. And then thinking about uplifting, again, multilingualism as an asset and how to articulate those things, but how to also leverage it in the workplace when they're speaking with others, and also have students practice using their elevator pitch with whether it's at student-led IEP meetings, during advisory, whether it's, you know, creating different opportunities for students to practice in a classroom setting, their elevator pitch and give feedback to one another is super helpful. Also for just thinking about professional networking, checking out, if you don't know, the LinkedIn has a student resource page. So thinking about checking out LinkedIn for student resources and just reiterating the importance of professional networking with your students. Many students are not aware of the importance of professional networking or what is social capital and how to leverage that. I had a conversation and I shared my experience with my interns, and really it was around like I maintained my professional network since I was in high school, and the way I got my first job in the DOE was through my professional network. They knew somebody who was hiring and they, you know, put in a good word for me, and said you're looking for a position, I know someone who's hiring. So like, not to minimize the importance and the leverage that professional networks can have, especially on our students in our community, and thinking about how your alumni can give back and support continuing the development of that professional network and creating a network for future WBLEs sites. So, you know, work-based learning employer sites, thinking about like how you can use your professional network to encourage that, as well as your students, your Ls, your students with disabilities are progressing on their career trajectory. Next slide.
Thank you, Yesenia. For the mock interviews and informational interviews, really sharing those interview tips and tricks to help students to really highlight their multilingualism as an asset. And students need to know that very specifically, if they go out into the workforce with their knowledge of another language, they have the potential to double their workplace's interaction with potential customer bases around New York City, which is really incredible. And we also want students to know that we can provide those opportunities for self-reflection if they're engaging in the mock interview process. One of the best lessons I, as a principal, observed for a CTE teacher was having his students recreate a panel where students were being interviewed, and the toughest questions were developed by the students' peers, and they really were very, very thorough in their questioning of their peer, much more than I would have been as their interviewer. So that's a great way for students to practice and to learn how the interview process goes, so they can normalize the uncertainty of going into an interview, but having already had that practice in class is a really wonderful thing. Also, in terms of integrated academics, getting your English department to support resume writing, cover letter writing, as well as the public speaking aspect of the interview process. That's a really wonderful thing to do, because you already have trained teachers in your sites who can support that if you're an integrated CTE high school. When we're thinking about internships, after school jobs, we definitely want to encourage students to participate in those after school clubs, jobs, and summer programs as much as we can, so they can build up their resume, and also so students can learn how to interact in a cooperative setting to collaborate on work tasks with students they may not normally go to school with. And you want to prepare, when you're thinking of those workshop sites, you want to prepare them based on your 16 vocational areas for New York State. You want to be sure that it's in alignment with the students' interests. And you also want to partner with CBOs who can potentially provide stipends for students who may be undocumented or offer unpaid opportunities. So when we're thinking about that, you want to think about what's your sharing with students' first job tips, how can they get to know each other, how can they get to know their employer, and what's the difference between having a work friend and an outside friend. And then you want to reinforce to the employers that this is a learning opportunity for students, and be able to share best practices to work with your students who are multilingual learners, language learners, as also students with disabilities, so that you have ongoing conversations with those employers about things your students can refine and get better with over time, because that's the work-based learning experiential part of the program, where they're really refining their skills so they can take it to the next level in the work site. Next slide, please.
Audrey, oh,
Yeah.
sorry. I was going to say, can I expand a little bit more before jumping onto the next slide about just because it was mentioned into the chat about kind of undocumented students and
Absolutely.
opportunities. So so the city is not allowed to use city funding. So thinking about like our big providers who provide internship opportunities for students. So like an SYP, ISP, all of these kind of opportunities that we provide our students, most of them are city funded. And the city does not allow undocumented students, unfortunately, to receive funded opportunities. So it's really important. The only way we're able to provide opportunities is if it's privately funded. So that's why when thinking about partnering with CBOs, really thinking about partnering with like community sites that are racially, culturally, and linguistically diverse and are able to provide stipends for students because they're not hourly paid, so they're stipends. Sometimes there are CBOs that actually have opportunities or ways that private funding that they leverage in order to provide students, specifically undocumented students, with internships. It's not necessarily paid in the same way like an hourly wage, but there are opportunities. So my advice or my suggestion is really thinking about what racially, culturally, and linguistically CBOs can you partner with or find partnerships or may exist in your school already, and really think about, hey, I have students who are undocumented. Is there any way that we can, make a little pilot program in order for them to get this experience and get paid for it? Because we know the payment piece is really important when thinking about that financial capital for our students and that financial mobility for them. So that would be my suggestion. And I wish, my dream is definitely to be able to provide undocumented students with opportunities. It just requires private funding that we currently do not have. Next slide. And I hope that answered your question a little bit more. And if not, we'll stick around to answer any other questions that come up. When thinking about service learning and community service projects, think about, so we're going to share DML's Navigating High School workbook with students, again, available in all 9 languages. And it really supports students with these type of activities. It's very digestible and it's scaffolded for students learning. And it really allows them to engage in things like creating a club, identifying projects like social justice projects that they're really passionate about and what to do with those projects. So thinking about that as well. For individual advisement and post-secondary planning, we definitely talked about the virtual advisement tool that DML has, but also thinking about, Prepare is about supporting students in creating a plan, so preparing a plan. And with that comes supporting students with tracking their classes and understanding transcripts and tracking graduation requirements that they may not be familiar with. They may not understand that you need 44 credits to graduate. So instead of taking that for granted, being able to share that with them as well and incorporate that into your class or into your curriculum. Provide students, we provided here a list of scholarship opportunities. There's this amazing app called Dreamers Roadmap, which provides scholarships for undocumented students in particular. So being able to leverage that. And then ensuring testing accommodations are submitted and shared, and also that schools, reach out to the Office of Accessibility. So thinking about testing accommodations, we haven't figured out the answer, and I know it's been a question that has been asked to me earlier this year around like L students, do they get testing accommodations for like industry exams? I know that Audrey has mentioned that students with IEPs do get those type of accommodations. However, our L students do get accommodations for SAT school day. So if a student is, or your school is participating in SAT school day, there's some testing accommodations that we've linked here for them to engage in the SAT. However, they must be submitted like 4 weeks in advance. So just being mindful of not only knowing that your students are allowed to receive these testing accommodations, but the timeline associated with the submission of those testing accommodations, and ensuring that they're submitted well in advance so that students can leverage that. We also included here for financial literacy, DML's EverFi Toolkit. I'm sure several of you are familiar with EverFi and the financial literacy activities that they engage with or that they have. So we've linked in here the EverFi DML toolkit, which uplifts their classes that are also that link to career readiness, but that are also available in multiple languages. And then we've also included here a financial case study filled with activities that you can embed into your curriculum, whether it's for CFM and or economics. And then I would also encourage you to have conversations with other educators and other content area teachers to see how they can also embed financial literacy into their curriculum, because having it be a standalone one-time course is not in the best interest of our students. I mean, I'm first generation college student born here, and I had challenges navigating the financial, the world of financial literacy. So really being able to not only break that down for students, but find multiple entry points and multiple opportunities to have these conversations embedded in your curriculum, I think is an opportunity for the content to land better with students. Next slide.
Thank you, Yesenia. I'm thinking back to my own college application experience. Again, as a first generation American, it really was a learning experience for me, my parents, my siblings, because we had no background in the American college application system. And also connected to that, in the chat, I put a link to our Manhattan TCAC scholarship website. There's about 4 pages there of different scholarships that all students, not just students with disabilities, but multilingual learners, all students can apply for. And it's a really great resource as we think about financial literacy and financial wellness, where we really want our students to avoid getting into student loan debt as much as possible, so we can change the trajectory of their financial life as they are becoming young adults. So when we're thinking about applying, this is the steps where we start taking the application process for admittance to college, a vocational program such as Access BR, national service, which for some of our students can be a pathway to citizenship, something to think about, and financial aid or acceptance to a job. And when we're thinking about our students moving along in their transition, we want to think why we're emphasizing the application as the third part of this phase, so that students can think about the culmination, and it's the ending, but it's also opening doors to their next stage of life as they move along in their transition. So students need to think of this as different layers of unpacking a situation, and how we can really provide those links, not just, oh, congratulations, you got in, you're good to go, providing the links with the students, with the families as part of a long-term linked service, because as Yesenia brought up earlier, the students that we impact the most are going to come back to us. And sometimes they'll come back to us and say, hey, I started my own company. Do you have any kids? I would love to work with some of your current students. So it's all part of a long, wonderful continuum for our students. Next slide, please.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm like into the chat. I'm like loving these things. And I do want to take like opportunities for us to uplift what we're seeing and some of these best practices, because these are really, really great. And really, the whole purpose of this is really to have a learning community, a shared learning community where we all learn together. We're all experts in the room. We're all doing this work. So thank you for kind of uplifting and putting your best practices into the chat. And we'll be sure to uplift them at some point. And if not, please, please, please unmute yourself at that time if you feel comfortable, and bring them up as well. If not, continue dropping them into the chat and we'll uplift them. So continuing on with service learning activities, Really important, providing students with a note catcher, graphic organizer, or reflection questions to help students make connections. So thinking about that note catcher that I dropped earlier into the chat, that's a great activity that you could do with your ELs, and it's very easy. It's just to help them organize their thoughts and follow along with the content. Something like that is very simple and very easy. And we've linked here some graphic organizers that you can check out, and you'll be able to have access to and utilize with your students. The other thing that I wanted to also mention is thinking about reminding students that these volunteer experiences, community service opportunities, also something that they can put into their resume. So these are all things that students can put into their resume, and definitely continue to think about this as they're continuing to engage in resume building. Along with thinking about apply, just thinking about school-based enterprise, youth apprenticeship, pre-apprenticeships, on-the-job training, co-op tech, work study, thinking about creating opportunities for students to practice completing job applications, or walking them through activities such as identifying common application errors. You know, practice, the tagline, practice makes perfect. Practice just makes students more comfortable and gives them the confidence levels that they really need in order to feel assured with the applications that they're completing. This might be some of the first time that they're completing job applications or internship applications. So being able to support them through this process is really essential. And again, DML is going to be releasing a job application, how to complete a job application, a workbook that goes through these things and also breaks down, like, if you're not a citizen, like, what are your next steps? How do you leverage something as, like, how do you use a W-9 in order to, like, work as an independent contractor? Or, like, what are these other steps and practices, like partnering with Action NYC in order to, like, know your rights as undocumented students or undocumented families, but also being able to, you know, take advantage of free legal services in case you want to become a DACA recipient. As a DACA recipient, you usually have, depending on the level of your status, you are able to work, versus, like, if you have no papers, then you're not able to work. So then thinking about some of those opportunities as well. And encouraging students to maintain a notebook or some type of note-taking device for them to take notes, stay organized, and continue to journal their experiences, while encouraging them to refine and, you know, rethink how their elevator pitch is helping them with, you know, communicating their assets, skills, and areas of growth that they recently did. Next slide.
Thank you, Yesenia. So as we move along on the application continuum, we want to think about individual advisement and post-secondary planning. And that's where you want to really engage in that virtual advisement to find different ways to support your L community and your students with disabilities as they prepare for the future, and can always thinking back to the 3 domains of transition: employment, education, and independent living. And this may be the time that families may start to disclose that they would be very interested in having students live independent of the family. And that's where you can reach out to your borough-based TCAC to get support on community-based organizations that may be able to assist in that process. We also want to think about the application process for your different post-secondary education endeavors, and that of course connects to college, but it also connects to vocational schools. And in that MN TCAC scholarship site that we put into the chat, there's also scholarships for vocational training, so that's really important to think of. And when students with disabilities are thinking of long-term connection to resources, you, as a school, you want to start an application VR process for a student at the beginning of their third year, their junior year. So this way, by the time the student either exits your program, leaves with the Regents diploma, leaves with the CDOS credential, they are already connected to Access VR. And a good rule of thumb is if you think a student with a disability may need vocational resources and support until they retire, sign them up for Access VR, because that way they can get those levels of support until they choose to retire at whatever age that's going to be in the future. For college applications and financial aid, you definitely want to explain to the students that they have to make connections to different personnel in the building to get the letters of recommendation. And having your students really know their elevator pitch about who they are and what they want and how they plan on achieving it is going to be extremely helpful for teachers who they may be asking letters of recommendation from, but the teacher needs more information. And you can certainly share the scholarship list that we put into the chat for your students to start to apply. Some of those scholarships are for young as students as 14, and the companies hold on to those monies for the students until they go to college, which is really wonderful. And then you also have the New York State DREAMS Act, and also sharing a real understanding of FAFSA, so students and families understand the process of applying to college, and small things that you may not think might be a big deal, but it's actually a big deal, where families have to disclose their financial information to the students and to the colleges. That's a big part of it. And when you get FAFSA training, that's where you understand those different layers to the college application process. But also students can take professional learning in financial aid through the TCACs, and they can also, like we said earlier, engage in the disability disclosure. So when the link is made to the College Office of Accessibility, they can explain what strengths they're bringing to the table and areas that they're still working on once they've gotten through that application process. Next slide, please.
So just to round this out, we want to continue to bring this back to the individual advisement and post-secondary planning. We want to make sure that you're working with your students to review the activities that they've completed within CTS, and just want to stress that, you know, folks hopefully are inputting all of the work that they're doing into CTS to be able to eventually, you know, run reports and find out exactly, you know, maybe what gaps your students have based on the system, as well as to really provide the CTE office an opportunity to, you know, work with you and make sure that your school is getting credit for what is already being done in your program. Also, you want to make sure to build a portfolio with your students with the inclusion of the important documents that were mentioned before: resume, cover letter, making sure that they're getting access to interview opportunities, etc. References even. Some of these things students tend to not save themselves, so it's great to be able to have a repository for this stuff. And hopefully CTS and other platforms that you're using will really contribute to them putting together their own individual portfolio. You want to ensure that they have the critical documents, like I said. So we have a couple of resources inclusive of a checklist that will be in the folder, so that you can use that as well to be able to just make sure you're taking a mental note of what students have accomplished. Also, you want to make sure you're linking their experiences to the employability profile, link to which CTE will provide. We are getting an update from NYSED on that document, so definitely stay tuned to see what the changes are with that. And then also making sure to review the workforce development and employment or certification opportunities that students might be eligible for within CBOs and other community and nonprofit organizations that would definitely provide that. So because we're running short on time, I'm going to kick it over to my colleague, Larry Williams, who will be able to take us through some more questions that will hopefully get the room talking a bit. And so I will hand it over to Larry.
Thanks, Takiyah. So if you could just, yep, next slide. So for our next poll question, we invite everybody back to the chat room. And from a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not very supportive and 5 being supportive, our question is, to what extent are your industry and college partners supporting you in this work? So if you can just take a minute to just, just indicate by number how involved your industry and college partners are in supporting the work that you do. Thanks, John. 3. A couple of 3s. 4. Partners 2. Thank you, Damaris, for breaking it down that way, because that's one of the other questions I think that we'd ask is, if they are involved, is it more of the college partner that's involved, or if it's the industry partner involved? So thank you. Couple of 3s. Please don't be afraid to put any 1s if there are any 1s, and if there's a 5, please put it. We'd love to hear them all. Okay. Well, for those of you who shared, thank you for sharing, because I know we're short on time. So I guess we can transition to the next slide.
Should we make this a larger group?
I'm sorry?
Should we make this a larger group, or should we still do breakouts?
We can make it a large group.
We can make it a larger group, I think.
I'm only thinking about time.
Yep. Yeah, we can make it a larger group. And so the next question is to the group, if you can, just please, I think you've done that earlier. So sharing your name, your school and position, you've done that already. But just to think of the next 2 questions, how do you make accommodations for these students within your scope of work? And how can you incorporate today's work in planning post-secondary options with your students? And please feel free to either unmute or to use the chat to share.
I think it's interesting. Vincent, thank you so much for your comment with the colleges. One thing to remember is that every college receives federal funding also has to have an Office of Accessibility. And don't forget, students should all be exposed to that, because you never know what the future brings. If you could have a disability tomorrow and you may need those services. So each college has an Office of Accessibility that students can engage with. Thank you, Vincent. That's really important.
So yeah, if anyone else wants to share, please unmute yourself. I think Vincent responded again.
Yes.
It's difficult to have employers make accommodations in some cases as the work they need completed, and they don't have time to give in-depth training. Okay.
Thank you, Vincent. One of the ways we can create a workaround for that is that you can connect with your borough-based TCACs to run disability disclosure seminars with your students, so that this way the young people can be prepared to know their rights and be able to ask for them in a way that's efficient for them and lets the employer know what they're obligated to do. Thank you.
I wonder if it would be helpful to link some of the other sessions, Audrey, that we've led for the WBL Institute as well in the resource folder for folks to be able to see some other best practices around some of these things.
Yes, yeah, I think that would be great. Yes, thank you, Yesenia. And thank you, Vincent. Great, we appreciate that.
I'm also wondering, and thinking about for the accommodations piece, just wondering if you've also, in thinking about your partners, not only thinking about industry and colleges, but thinking about those CBO partners that might exist in your building who might have connections and touch points to industry partners. So when thinking about your partners, just think holistically as to who those can be, including families who might run a business and might be willing to have an opportunity with a student as well.
And also those alumni networks, your former students, many of them, especially in the CTE world, love to be entrepreneurs and run their own small businesses, which we know is the backbone of the American economy. And they are always very interested in continuing connections with the fantastically trained workforce that you as CTE teachers are developing over time.
And Takiyah, are you going to take, or Larry, are you taking this last slide?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, on behalf of the presenters, on behalf of the CTE team, we just like to thank everyone for attending. If you have any information, any follow-up information or follow-up questions, actually, you can email Division of Multilingual Learners. The email is listed on the screen, or the Manhattan Transition and College Access Center. The email's on the screen, but we'll also be sharing out today's resources in a folder. Everyone will receive that link of the presentations and all resources attached to it. So on behalf of myself and all our presenters, we thank you for attending.
Thank you.
Have a happy school day.
Thanks so much, everybody. I guess we have a few minutes if you have time to hang out in between sessions. The next one starts, I believe, at 11.